Richard gave a talk to us a few months ago about overturning Citizens United and passing a constitutional amendment saying money is not speech and corporations are not people, and that's a great topic. But at some point he mentioned this, these Mondragon Cooperatives in Spain, and from what he said it sounded like they were sort of humanist utopias. So I immediately after his talk said, would you come back and give us a talk on these humanist utopias? Or at least that's what it sounds like to me. So he kindly agreed. So we're real happy to have him back here today to talk about that. So yeah, I'll just read here. The title is The Mondragon Cooperatives. With 120 worker-owned cooperatives developed over nearly 6 decades, the Mondragon Cooperatives in the Basque region of northern Spain offer perhaps the most shining example on the planet Earth of institutions that are democratic, egalitarian, cooperative, sustainable, and kind. With no laid-off workers since 1956 and higher income than Spanish workers, what lessons can we learn from the largest worker-owned cooperatives in the Western world? Richard Hobbs, who's an immigration attorney, former director of the Office of Human Relations of Santa Clara County, and executive director of Human Agenda, will discuss, having just returned from his latest visit to Mondragon. So please give Richard a very warm welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. You can hear me okay? Yes? We're good? Okay. I did really want to thank Paul for raising the issue of Central American children. As it turns out, in the last 8 months, I've been an election observer in the national presidential elections in Honduras and El Salvador, and prior to that in Mexico. And the law does state that Central American children, in other words, children from a country that does not have a contiguous border with the United States, are eligible to apply for political asylum. Mexican children are not. And one of the, I was at the presidential election where the FMLN won the election in El Salvador. It was the second period that they had won. They won 5 years prior, but it's just so difficult to raise a very poor country up from the worldwide economic institutions of exploitation and the conditions of the International Monetary Fund, etc., and actually find a way to develop the health and education and welfare and employment of the people in these very poor nations. And so our international institutions and our trade policies like CAFTA and NAFTA have a lot to do with the fact that there are very few opportunities, and in fact children are in a situation where they're being recruited to gangs and they're trying to avoid it, and they're not being very successful. And in El Salvador, for example, I learned that when the FMLN took power 5 years ago, there was a 62% unemployment rate. Through actually the formation of cooperatives making uniforms and school supplies and backpacks for children, they've been able to lower the unemployment rate in El Salvador from 62% to 50%. So El Salvador only has a 50% unemployment rate today. And you can imagine, you know, what that means in terms of the lack of opportunity and how important it is for children to have an opportunity to grow in a healthy environment. Thomas Paine once wrote that we as human beings, quote, have it in our power to begin the world over again. And perhaps that quote from over 200 years ago is more prescient today than it was over 2 centuries ago. So instead of American exceptionalism that is so often used to describe the technological and consumer advances in the United States of America, today the United States is facing unprecedented challenges when compared to the other 28 industrialized nations on Earth. For example, the United States has the highest inequality of all of those countries, of those 28 nations. We also work the longest hours, longer hours than any in the other 28 industrialized nations. We also have the biggest failure of democracy. There is no Citizens United in any of the other 27 countries, where corporations can give unlimited amounts of money anonymously to candidates. It just doesn't exist in any other of those industrialized nations. We still don't have a public national health care system for all in the United States, which the other countries do have. We're the only country where employers are not required to give vacation time to employees, and where employers are not required to give sick time to employees, paid sick time or paid vacation time. We're also the only country where there is no paid maternity leave. There is no federal policy in the United States for paid maternity leave, as opposed to all of the other advanced industrial nations on Earth. And in terms of immigration, we have the biggest discrepancy between any two borders on planet Earth, between the United States and Mexico, in terms of the degrees of inequality between those two nations. So I have to conclude that we're in dire need in this country of an eco-humanist alternative. We need an alternative both to the unlimited growth model and the profit motive model of capitalism in our country, which really the unlimited growth and the profit motive are destroying our planet and creating human beings that are not only exploited, poor, or getting poor, but they're increasingly alienated from meeting their human potential. We need a sustainable, human needs-based vision of a better world. And these are the issues that the nonprofit that I've been working with for the last dozen years are trying to promote. Currently, just briefly, Human Agenda is involved in a number of projects. Number one, I don't know if you know, but now there is a statewide proposition, Proposition 49. So I hope everybody becomes a 49er. This will be on the November ballot, and it's asking our federal and state elected officials to support a 28th Amendment to the Constitution, to get big corporate money out of politics, to affirm that only real human beings have constitutional rights, not corporations, and to affirm that we, the people, through our elected representatives and not through the unelected Supreme Court of the United States of America, have the right to regulate campaign contributions and expenditures. The U.S. Supreme Court has taken that right away. So we will have that on the November ballot. Secondly, Human Agenda has a cooperatively run organic community garden. We're also an anchor organization for what's being now called the Polycentric U.S. Social Forum. There was a U.S. Social Forum in Atlanta, another one in Detroit, and now next June there will be 3 sites around the United States, including San Jose, where we expect about 10,000 people to come under the slogan, another world is possible, another United States is necessary. We've also, Human Agenda, conducted emulation tours. We call them emulation tours because we think there are best practices that are emulatable. And so we've actually conducted 2 tours. The first one was to Cuba, and then this month, earlier this month in July, to the Mondragon Cooperatives in northern Spain. We also are planning another emulation tour to Cuba in January, and then next summer to Copenhagen, to Denmark, which is considered the happiest country on earth, according to all the gross national happiness indicators and the UN indicators, and to Amsterdam, the Netherlands, where I just came back from also, where the children are considered to be the happiest on earth. They have the happiest children on earth according to a number of indicators in the Netherlands. And finally, we're also convening a South Bay meeting on the potential establishment of cooperatives on August 9th in San Jose. And really none of this would be possible if Human Agenda had not been working on a vision for a better world. And really that vision has kind of three parts. One is a human needs-based analysis of, what are our needs as human beings and how can we organize them in a way in our individual lives and in our social lives to meet our human needs. And then secondly, how do we create institutions that really meet those needs? And third, I think it's more critical than ever to talk about taking individual responsibility to take action, because we so frequently don't walk the walk. And so a lot of times people consider personal responsibility a quote-unquote Republican value, but when Gandhi was asked the question, what's more important, social rights or individual responsibility, he didn't hesitate to say individual responsibility, because how do you have social rights if you don't have individual responsibility? So we really want to emphasize the fact that we need to work on creating a better world. So briefly, in terms of that vision, we've actually asked people on different continents and different groups about 60 different times to identify their human needs, and it takes about 15 minutes to do so. We've asked people in Europe, in Latin America, in Asia, and a lot of groups locally to identify their needs, and very quickly people can identify their individual needs, in terms of their physiological needs and their psychological needs, and then also what it would take for any society to reproduce itself, which is also, those social needs are also human needs. So based upon that analysis of human needs, we've really come up with a vision that really is comprised of 5 pieces. That first of all of us need to take responsibility for what we call care work. Care work means that we need to take care of ourselves first. We're useless to the world if we don't take care of ourselves, and we need to take care of our families and our immediate community. So that's the care work. None of us can take care of 7 billion people, but we can take care of ourselves. We can make every effort to eat right, to exercise right, to take care of our children, to take care of our parents, to take care of our family, and to do all of those things in the household, for example, that will allow the successful children to grow up in a healthy way. Secondly, reduced working hours with a living wage. Producing something of value for society. So this is really the fulcrum of a vision for a better world, in my opinion. The Europeans get it, the US doesn't get it. The European trade union movement has been fighting for reduced work hours, and they have the 35-hour work week. Mondragon only works 1,722 hours per year, as opposed to over 2,000 a year in the United States. A lot of the European nations get it, that if we don't have reduced work hours at a living wage, that we don't have time to be fully human, we don't have time to participate in the community, we don't have time to take care of ourselves. The average couple only speaks to each other 12 minutes per day in the United States, so a lot of times there isn't even a relationship between a married couple. And so reduced work hours is critical to meeting our potential in every aspect of our lives. Third, lifelong education with reliable information. And fourth, we all need a decision-making structure at different levels of our lives, including inside the family, but at the local government, in our workplace, etc., that hopefully is democratic. And finally, at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we need time for ourselves, for self-realization. That was at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I believe it's true, we all need free time to be able to engage in our passions and to fully develop in the ways that we individualize ourselves and make ourselves whole as human beings. So I'm saying all this because this is the frame of how I think Mondragon has worked to create cooperatives to meet all of these needs. And I'll talk about that after I present some of the main features of Mondragon. But in addition to understanding that we have these individual and social human needs, it's really important to, as the humanist society has done, to entertain a series of values in terms of the kinds of institutions that we want to create. And the values that we've decided upon in Human Agenda are 5. Number 1, that institutions be democratic. Number 2, that they be egalitarian. Try to reduce the income differentials, for example, and income levels between different groups. Number 3, that they be cooperative. Number 4, sustainable, which is ever more important in our world today. And number 5, something we often forget, and that's to be kind. We need institutions where people can actually be nice to each other. That's an unusual thought. And so those are the values that we believe, if we can inculcate those values into the institutions that are meeting these needs, we can recreate the world, as Thomas Paine said. I'd like to move on and talk about Mondragon. Mondragon is a network of 120 worker-owned cooperatives. It is in the Basque region of Spain. And in terms of the Basque region, there are 4 provinces in Spain that are Basque or Euskera speaking, and 3 in France. I actually visited a town in France that's Basque speaking, and there are about 1 million speakers of the Basque language, which nobody has ever discovered the origin of in the history of the world, but there are about 1 million who speak Euskara. Under Francisco Franco, I actually spent my junior year abroad in Madrid in 1970-71. And so at that time, Franco was still in power, and I had classes at the University of Madrid, and there was only one entrance into the Department of Political Science, and there were, they called it the Guardia Civil, the civil guard, which was Franco's kind of tonton macoute, you know, that would enforce the policies of Franco. So if we walked around the hallways of, 3 people, they would split us up. The civil guard would split us up because we were plotting the overthrow of Franco. And I often wondered why my philosophy teacher never showed up on Monday morning, or rarely showed up on Monday morning. And as it turns out, this wonderful man, his name was Enrique Tierno Galvan, was being arrested pretty much every weekend because I learned after the fact that he was the Secretary General of the Socialist Party of Spain. And the only job that he could get was teaching gringos philosophy. But he spoke 14 languages, he had a high level of math, like of Bertrand Russell. He was a genius. And once Franco actually exited from power, he died in 1975, Enrique Tierno Galvan became the mayor of Madrid, and he had 200,000 people at his funeral. So he was very beloved by the people of Spain. In the Basque region, there is a long history of working especially in iron and steel from thousands of years ago. And you probably know that because of the language and the customs, that the Basque region has been one of the most fiercely independent and autonomous regions on earth, really. But in Spain, it's the only, there are 17 what are called autonomías, which are autonomous regions in Spain. And of those 17 autonomous regions, the Basque region is the only one that doesn't pay taxes to Madrid. So they collect their taxes, even Catalonia, which around Barcelona, which has their own separatist movement going on right now, they pay their taxes to Madrid, and then Madrid gives them money back. In the case of the Basque region, it's the other way around. They collect all the taxes and then give the lowest percent of any of the autonomous regions to Spain. It's a negotiated deal to Madrid. only 10% goes to the federal government. And so in our opinion, in the opinion of Human Agenda, this is a best practice in the sense that local people have local control of local resources and are able to use those resources to meet their needs, much closer to the people and the needs of the people than Madrid, which is 400 kilometers away from the Basque region. So the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation, it's actually a corporation, is a social enterprise with deep roots in the Basque culture. It's founded for and by the people, inspired by the core principles of cooperation, commitment to the environment, high competitiveness, and client satisfaction, with the goal of creating wealth in society through entrepreneurial development and job creation, preferably using cooperatives. This is the mission statement of the Mondragon Cooperatives. So it's based on a number of values, a commitment to solidarity that we'll talk about in a little bit. It uses democratic systems, one person, one vote. It encourages participation in management, in outcomes, and in ownership. It promotes training and innovation, and it uses a very distinct management model that actually in the European Union has received more awards for its management model than any other entity or country in the European Union. The Mondragon Cooperative Corporation is the largest set of cooperatives on earth. There are 120 cooperatives with 100,000 workers and total annual sales of almost $20 billion. There are also 83,000 full-time jobs worldwide. There are 66,000 full-time workers in Spain and 14,000 full-time workers overseas. The largest corporation in the Basque region is the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation, which is also the fourth biggest employer in Spain. And this Mondragon Cooperative Corporation is the first system of cooperatives on earth. There are 86 industrial cooperatives, including machine tools, auto components, elevators, home appliances. There is one bank or credit union, which is called Laboral Cucha, and there is one kind of Costco throughout Spain. It's called Eroski, and all of the Eroski retail outlets are part of the Mondragon Cooperative. There are also 4 agricultural. For example, there are 6 people who grow 50,000 rabbits per year. And that's an example of a small but effective agricultural cooperative of Mondragon. They also have service cooperatives. One of the new areas is elder care, but they have maintenance care and a whole number of service cooperatives also, and 8 educational nonprofits, including 15 research and development institutions and their own university, the Mondragon University, which was established about 20 years ago. In terms of the history of Mondragon, in 1943, a Jesuit father, Jose Maria, and I don't know if you can say this word or not, but his name is Arizmendi Arrieta. Arizmendi Arrieta. It's a long last name. But Jose Maria Arizmendi Arrieta established a technical school in 1943 during the heart of the Franco years. And in 1956, 5 engineers established what they called at that time Ulgor, which later became Fagor, and that became the first cooperative, building washing machines and refrigerators. And it's also a factory that I visited last September, and it was the mothership of the Mondragon Cooperatives, and it went out of business in November. I'm going to talk about that too. It could no longer compete with the Chinese, basically. That was the main reason it went out of business. In 1959, they established their own social welfare system. It's called Lagunaro, which provides additional safety net programs in addition to what Spain offers, which is more than what we get in the United States of America, as I just mentioned. In 1997, as I mentioned, it established a university. So the corporate values are four: cooperation, participation, social responsibility, and innovation. Father Jose Maria, as a lot of people call him because his last name is too long, was a strong believer in constant innovation. He said that unless people are constantly educated and re-educated and learning and innovating on a daily basis, that the experiment of the cooperatives will not work. And so throughout the whole cooperative movement, there is a very strong emphasis on knowledge, education, and innovation. The cooperatives more or less turn our conventional business model upside down. In the conventional corporation, like in Silicon Valley, I think we know that the power lies with the people who own the capital. In the Mondragon Cooperatives, the power really lies in the workers because they are worker owners. And the entry fee is 15,000 euros, about $22,000 to become a worker owner. The cooperative principles include an open admission to the cooperatives, a democratic organization, the sovereignty of labor, the instrumental character of capital, so that capital is used as an instrument to develop human beings instead of the other way around, participatory management, pay solidarity, I'll talk about that, cooperation between cooperatives, which I think is the fulcrum of the success of the Mondragon experience, social transformation, education, and solidarity with other social justice movements. The basic structure is that each cooperative has worker owners, and they elect people to a General Assembly that is held every year. The General Assembly then creates a governing board, and the governing board then hires managers. However, the worker owners have the right to fire their managers at any time. And instead of a union dealing with wages and working conditions, they have something called the social council in every single workplace in the 120 cooperatives. The social council meets at least monthly, and they deal with issues that come up, you know, in the factory or in the organization. And the general manager generally kind of calls the shots. They want a person in that position in the cooperative to be open to, for example, really be inclusive with the decision-making process and really be open to workers getting more and more training. And the very last day of the seminar in Mondragon, there was an analysis about what was called emancipatory workers versus workers who didn't feel that emancipated at the workplace. And we're basically talking about what happens, I think, in a lot of institutions. It's the bureaucratization of the workplace. And so what was identified ultimately as the key factor in terms of whether or not workers really continue to feel motivated after decades of work is whether or not the manager was allowing, you know, those kinds of opportunities for increased democratic involvement and increased training and a set of 6 other factors that are critical to making people feel part of the process. So as you can imagine, a worker owner still gets up in the morning and goes to work and has a job. It's very similar to what we do in the United States of America. The difference is that they receive a return on their investment because they're worker owners, and they also can hire and fire. They can fire their manager, and through the General Assembly, they decide the direction not only a general assembly of their own cooperative, but also the general assembly of all of the cooperatives. They decide the direction of their cooperative and of the Mondragon experiment of 120 cooperatives. So those are huge differences compared to the average worker that goes on the plant floor today, for example, in the United States. I want to talk a little bit about inter-cooperation, because the 120 co-ops share centralized support services. I think this is the main difference between Mondragon and, for example, co-ops in the United States. You may not know there are 29,000 cooperatives in the United States. And on our trip, we had a cooperative from Milwaukee that was established in 1980 that makes machine parts, 62 people that had 31 of them worker owners. And what they don't have is the inter-cooperative support. That's what Mondragon really brings. It's a social support network that allows everybody to feel secure. As was mentioned in the introduction, since 1956, nobody has ever been laid off in the Mondragon experience. That's a real different approach than what we have going on in our own country. So the centralized support includes support for health and well-being, for education, for financial services, and for research and development. Lagunaro is the social welfare system, and if a person, for example, a cooperative goes belly up, which they do in the Mondragon system, sometimes they can no longer compete, including the flagship cooperative just went belly up last November. When the cooperative can no longer compete and is no longer profitable, then the unemployed co-op members get what's called employment aid. They really don't call it unemployment compensation, they call it employment aid. They make it a positive frame. And they get 80% of their salary for up to 2 years. In the history of the Mondragon experiment, nobody has ever gone beyond 2 years. In other words, if a cooperative goes belly up, then they get 80% of their salary, and within those 2 years, everybody has either taken early retirement, which is an option once you're past 60 years old, or they have been employed in another one of the 119 cooperatives, the other cooperatives that exist. With respect to healthcare, they only pay €9 a month, which is maybe $13, $14 a month. And this is a supplement, as I said, to the Spanish social welfare system, including the single-payer healthcare that Spain has right now. And so, as an example, like the Canadian system, frequently in Spain, somebody will have to wait several months before they can get an operation, knowing that they need the operation. What the Mondragon cooperatives do is they make sure that they get that operation within a few days. And this has a number of advantages. Number one, that person is not idle. Number two, that person is back on the job and productive and producing for the Mondragon cooperatives. They do have a pension that is complementary to Spain. So people are paying a significant amount. Actually, 18% of their salary goes into their pension, and they get all of that and more back when they retire. And that's on top of the Spanish pension. So they're getting two pensions, basically. The pension from working in Spain and paying taxes in Spain, and also the pension from the Mondragon cooperatives. So really, when people retire, they do have a life. They have significant income. And in terms of sick leave, they receive 80% of salary the first day and 90% of their salary starting at 5 months if they have a long-term sickness. The Lagunauer investments, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of a model of meeting human needs, we would like people producing and investing in industries that are socially responsible. And so Mondragon does not invest in war weapons, pornography, gambling, or tobacco. But they will invest in, they do have a big investment portfolio. It's one of the biggest investors in all of Spain, because they're basically collecting the pensions of people during their whole lives. And with that money, they're able to invest, and they've had a very good return on investment. As they said, 66% is invested in German bonds, not Greek or Spanish. So they are investing in places where they're certain to get a good return, and it's a safe investment. The mandatory retirement age is 65, and in some cases, a person can retire as early as 58. A widower receives 90% of the pension. And if you leave Mondragon before retirement, which happens very rarely, retirement age, then you take what you paid in with you. Obviously, that pension is yours. As I mentioned, there is employment aid for people who are no longer needed in a cooperative. And if a co-op does need a person, it needs to actually first ask Lagunaro, which is the more or less clearinghouse for personnel, to place somebody who needs that job in that cooperative. So the cooperative can't go outside the 120 cooperatives first, looking for an employee. First, they have to see what the needs are of unemployed cooperative members inside the Mondragon system. If there is nobody, then they can certainly hire from outside. In terms of actually becoming a worker owner, if they hire an employee, within 3 years, they are usually asked, it's like a probationary period, and at the end of those 3 years, if they want to buy in and become a cooperative member, 15,000 euros per year, then they can do so. And in the next 3 years, if they don't have 15,000 euros, they can take that out of their monthly paycheck, basically, in order to become a worker owner. Sometimes a factory, for example, just has no need to be working 5 days a week. And so that's where cooperation really makes a difference. The worker owners themselves decide through different forms of flexible work time, for example, to work a 4-day week for a 3-month period. But they make that decision, whether or not to do that or not. They also bank hours, and so instead of paying time and a half, they give the equivalent of comp time. So if there is a huge demand where you need to work 60 hours a week, 1 week, by the end of the year, you're supposed to take those 20 hours that you've done in overwork as comp time, as vacation time. In terms of quality of life, the number of mandatory paid vacation days is 30, 6 weeks. The number of mandatory holidays is 11. And by the way, that's 41 mandatory days that we don't have in the United States of America. They have paid sick leave of 1.5 to 2 years under Spanish Social Security law. They have 16 weeks of paid maternity leave, 2 weeks of paid paternity leave, and a total number of hours worked of 1,722, which, as I mentioned, is about 300 hours less than in the United States. In fact, I'm part of a group in the United States called Take Back Your Time, and Take Back Your Time Day is celebrated on October 24th every year in the United States. The reason it's October 24th is because from October 24th until December 31st is 9 weeks, and 9 weeks is the average amount of time that the average American works longer than the average European. We work 9 weeks more per year than the average European. In terms of the organization, for every 20 persons in the Lagunaro organization, they have one delegate to the General Assembly. So they basically elect delegates to their General Assembly. And they can have a person represent them, but only for 1 year. After that, they have to go back to the General Assembly if that representative has been elected, or if they're at the General Assembly of their local cooperative. So they also have a foundation. It's called the Mundukide Foundation that provides community service in different countries around the world, including in Africa and Latin America. And I think one of the most important things to conclude about the Mondragon Cooperatives is that they have a system. I won't go into the exact percentages, but everybody gets a gross pay, for example. From that gross pay, 10% is immediately, I'm sorry, let me talk about the cooperative first. If the cooperative has a profit, that gross profit is used in a number of ways. 10% is automatically put into a social investment fund of all 120 cooperatives. 15 to 40% by law has to go to the sector that they're in. So if they're in an industrial sector, they have to set aside 15 to 40% for that sector. So they're also protecting their sector and having access to funds to be able to allow that sector to, for example, create new cooperatives. And one example of that, actually, Mondragon just changed the Spanish law last year. They have now something very special. It allows cooperatives to establish a cooperative. So now, for example, one example is a cooperative that was established with the investment of 3 different Mondragon cooperatives and 2 worker owners that each put in 15,000 euros. After a 5-year period, the 3 cooperatives that have invested in that new cooperative will withdraw and no longer have a vote, for example, on the governing council of the new cooperative, and will no longer have an investment. They'll basically be bought out. And new worker owners will step in, and they'll have a new cooperative. They will have created new jobs, and so they do have a system for actually creating new jobs and in new sectors of the Mondragon experiment. Also, every single worker and cooperative has to pay into an education fund. So they recognize, as I said earlier, the importance of knowledge and innovation, and there's a requirement that everybody pay into that education fund. So I think, as you can see, I won't go into a lot more of the details, but as you can see, what makes Mondragon special and unique and successful is the fact that they're able, through inter-cooperative cooperation, to sustain themselves, because they're working in the middle of the capitalist world market, and they need to compete with China. And so let me just say briefly what happened to Fagor. Fagor was the mothership, as I mentioned, although Fagor has a number of different industries. The biggest factory was an domestic appliances, they called it. Aparatos domésticos is what they called it. And it produced refrigerators and washing machines. Last September, when I visited that plant, it was still in operation. We were shown, for example, a single line that was completely roboticized. There was one machine operator, and that machine operator with those robotics and those machines could not compete with 10 Chinese laborers. And because of that, Fagor closed down. It had basically had about 3 or 4 years of operating in the negative, and finally they had to say, we just can't sustain the mothership cooperative anymore. There were 1,800 workers in that plant, and 1,100 of them since last November have been placed in the other 119 cooperatives. So 1,100 of them have already been found other work, and that's the big advantage of, once again, of inter-cooperative cooperation. 300 of them took early retirement, and about 350 at this time are getting what's called employment aid, 80% of their salary for up to 2 years. We don't know exactly what will happen in 2 years. In the history of Mondragon, nobody has ever actually gone through the 2-year period and been laid off without any income. We don't know what will happen, but the approach of Mondragon is we're going to find jobs for every single one of these 350 remaining people within our cooperative system. I do want to just end, and then we can have Q&A for 10, 15 minutes, by saying, to go back to the vision and how important it is to have time for your self-care work. The working of 1,722 hours a year as opposed to over 2,000 a year provides the opportunity for people to socialize more, to take care of their children more. Pretty much if you're in the city of Mondragon, which has 26,000 people, and then there are a whole number of small cities that have a lot of cooperative members. Mondragon itself has 60% of the people work in cooperatives. But you'll notice in the early afternoon and on the weekends, it's very social. Everybody is outside enjoying themselves. You know Europe, there are so many restaurants that are, with tables outside. People take the time to know each other and to spend time with each other. And honestly, I think studies have shown that at the end of life, when people are asked, how would you rather spend your time working or spending time with family and friends, most people say family and friends. They wish that they had had more time, to spend with their family and their friends as opposed to work, which is what we do in the United States. So in terms of care work, I believe they have a system that allows people to take care of themselves and others, which is, I think, a best practice. Number two, they do have reduced work hours at a living wage. In fact, the minimum wage in the Mondragon cooperatives is 2 times as high as the Spanish minimum wage. So the minute that you start working for Mondragon, as an employee and not as a worker owner, for example, if that's what you're employed as, the minimum wage is double that of the Spanish minimum wage. So that's really critical, because if you don't have a living wage, you can't do the other things in life that make us fully human. Third, they've really made an attempt to inculcate lifelong learning in the daily lives and training needs in each one of the cooperatives. And fourth, in terms of decision making, honestly, how many employees do we have in the United States that can fire their boss? And how many that are making decisions about how much to produce and how to distribute it and how much to invest in the future? We don't really have those practices in the United States. And finally, in terms of this vision of a better society, self-realization, once again, having the free time to be able to do those things that make us fully human really provides a basis, a foundation for a much more well-rounded life. So now I want to talk about the values real quickly, because in terms of democracy, this is an experiment in democratically owned enterprises, and it has been working since 1956. So these are all enterprises that are democratically run. Secondly, in terms of equality, the differential between the lowest paid worker, which is twice the minimum wage in Spain, and the highest paid worker is 1 to 5. I just read in this morning Mercury News that the differential in the United States is 1 to 296. And I've also heard as high as 398 in Silicon Valley. In terms of Cooperation, well, that's what they're all about. Not only cooperation in the workplace, but inter-cooperative cooperation. And cooperation to even establish new cooperatives. So there's a huge emphasis on cooperation. In terms of sustainability, in every one of their plants, they have a committee that's working to try to make the plant as green and sustainable as possible. And their products also. And finally, in terms of this subjective factor of kindness, I think when you're in a structured environment like the one I've been talking about, it's much easier to be nice knowing that you have lifelong, for example, job security, that you have a wage that will allow you to meet your basic needs as a human being. You're not gnawing and fighting to survive. You're thriving. You're in a system of thriving instead of surviving. And I think that creates an environment of potential kindness. And you can't force anybody to be nice to anybody else. But I think that when you have your basic security needs met, it's much easier to be a little bit nicer to people than when you don't. And with that, I'd be glad to entertain any comments, questions, answers.
Okay,
I think you had your hand up first.
All right, tell you, I will follow your lead. We'll do one question at a time, but I'll take the mic to whoever you want to talk to. So who? Hang on, it needs to be for the video, so it's, hey, there you go.
Tell me that. Okay, you were talking about the wage, that there can be one person making up to 5 times more than the other person in the same, is it in the same co-op, or is it from one co-op to another?
No, it's in the same co-op.
In the same co-op.
But in
okay.
general, even between all of the co-ops, the basic wage differential is 1 to 5.
Wow, okay. Okay, well, that's interesting. My daughter is in a worker-owner co-op in San Francisco, and it's called Arizmendi Bakery. Now I know where the Arizmendi came from.
Exactly.
I'm sure. And I'm pretty sure that they all, I mean, their startup cost is much less, for one thing. I think it was $3,000, and there are about 15 people in the co-op. But from what I understand is all of them make the same wage, and they share in all the profits. And so, and the other question I would have is about the startup costs. If you have something that doesn't have big startup costs, like a chicken farm, you know, you're 6 people running it, versus a big mechanized kind of industrial situation, is the fee is the same for the co-op?
Yes, the fee is the same, but fortunately, Mondragon has the 2nd largest bank in the Basque region and the 4th largest bank in Spain. And so for highly industrial co-ops that are new, the estimate is 300,000 euros to create 1 job. And obviously, a worker contributing 15,000 euros is not going to make it. And so this is where the investment bank comes in. It's called Laboral Cuxta, and they make the investment, and then over time, with the profit that is earned, they pay that money back. So it's basically a loan from the bank. But they do have a bank and loaning at like 1% interest. It's way below the Spanish banking system interest rate. But that's a difficult decision to make, to start a new capital-intensive co-op. But they are, I think that Mondragon is known worldwide because 86 of the 120 co-ops are industrial. And that there is a lot of value added in those industrial co-ops. So they've been able to create a lot of value over the years, create a very large bank, and with that, they're able to reinvest. Yes, whoever.
I enjoyed this. I was curious, being a lawyer who notoriously do work long hours, has this affected you in terms of how you live your own life and wanting to be more with your own family? And also, I wanted the name of your nonprofit as well.
Okay, the name of the nonprofit is Human Agenda, and I try very hard. But I think all of us in this room have problems probably with work-life balance, especially when you're working full-time. I do have to say, however, that as an immigration attorney, I probably only work about 35 hours a week. I probably work another 30 hours a week doing the things that give me passion, including this. So I don't consider that work. I don't consider being here work, for example.
It's up to you.
Anybody you want to choose.
This is fascinating. I'm wondering, so these cooperatives are started in an area where there's already a value of autonomy, and so I'm wondering whether it's been replicated in other places and how you see in the United States the prospect for us to be able to be successful and get started, and sounds like there are some examples.
There is a person who is the Mondragon representative in the United States. Michael Peck is his name. And you can probably Google his name. And he gave a marvelous presentation about the efforts of Mondragon to provide support to cooperatives in the United States. There are a number of issues in terms of having intercooperative cooperation in the United States. That's probably the single biggest problem right now, and also investment funds for cooperatives. And so there are some minuscule changes in law, including New York City, including the federal government, in the Department of Agriculture, that have created some small funds to begin co-ops. But we're talking about $1 million. We're talking about $250,000 in New York City. The mayor of Richmond, Gail McLaughlin, created a fund to establish co-ops. She actually went to Mondragon and to Cuba. And so she was influenced by the cooperatives in both places. And so the city of Richmond, but these are all just very incipient, and they don't have the legs that Mondragon stands on. And that is innovation and knowledge and investment, and that intercooperation. Those are some of the legs that we don't have in the United States of America. And so it's a real struggle. Two of the three people who are staff members for the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives were on this Human Agenda emulation tour, one from New York and one from San Francisco. And they gave a presentation about the current status of cooperatives in the United States. And there are just beginnings of incipient funding, and the discussion of having existing cooperatives actually pay into a solidarity fund. For example, the cooperative in Milwaukee that I talked about does not pay any money into a cooperative fund, and so if they go belly up, and that's the end of the cooperative. And those worker owners are not going to be placed anywhere because they have no support. And so it is a huge challenge in the United States. You have to survive within, this economic system, and there is no, at this time, there is no social support system for cooperatives in the United States. So it's an uphill struggle to create cooperatives and to be competitive in the United States. I think he had his hand up.
So actually, there have been a whole bunch of people making eye contact and raising hands. We are really short on time. Lunch is almost ready. I think we can do one more question.
I think he had his hand, well, the two of them, if you don't mind, because they both had their hands up quite a while.
Well, we're going to have to break for lunch. So pick one. You pick one.
Okay, this woman was first. She was first, because she had her hand up second.
Thank you, Richard. You mentioned that the management system was acknowledged throughout Europe, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
The management system has gone through a number of evolutions, and now I think the most important element of that management system is that they are being evaluated by the worker owners themselves, and their salary depends, and the worker owners themselves' salary, there's a small amount each year that depends upon their evaluation, not only of the workers, but also of the managers. I think the fact that worker owners have the right through the General Assembly and the Governing Council to get rid of their managers has been a huge factor. But I also believe that they've used every possible single management technique available to them. I really can't go into any more detail than that.